as well. She's a Muslim, and to come to that particular position, it's a tremendous achievement for her, and it's something that we all must be very proud of, because the issue of mainstreaming, mainstreaming the contribution of women in the affairs of the affairs of this country is a debate that has been there for very many years. And we're beginning to see some traction in terms of on that front. And so she also comes out as a standout appointment for what President William Ruto did yesterday. And also there are other minor appointments as well within the military. Remember, there was a gentleman who was in the Navy as well, Thomas Nganga Njoroge, who had been appointed as the Navy commander and has now been posted to the National Defense University as the Deputy Vice Chancellor. And so bringing in a new player, an old friend of ours, of my family, General Paul Otieno, worked in Mombasa for many years. He was a MD for the Kenya Shipyard Limited, which is also a state institute, a state parastatal that works on deals with the construction work. A very competent general who now heads the Navy. A very big congratulations to him. And as for the president, he had no choice, because there is a vacuum there, and somebody had to fill in eventually somebody had to fill in for the late great General Ogolla. And so technically, by virtue of General Kariri being the Vice Chief of Defense, ordinarily you'd expect then him to be able to take over the position as the next Chief of Defense Force, because that's how it works. But it does not necessarily meet the Tonje rules as we purport, because General Ogolla was he was from the Navy. He was from the Air Force, and he just served a year. That term was actually supposed to serve 4 years. Many people argued that it ought to actually have been gone to an Air Force commander, because then he would be able to serve the remaining 3 years. And that would have technically been General Omenda. But President, as he's done, he's been able to rotate that, and brought in a guy from the Navy. Remember, just before we had General Kariri, who was the Deputy Commander of Navy, there was a gentleman there who was the Commander of the Navy called Jimson Mutai, a guy from West Pokot in Kapenguria there. Then he was moved. He was ordinarily, had the president stuck to the plans, then General Jimson Mutai would have been the Chief of Defense Force. But for whatever reason, and based on his own wisdom, the president moved him into the Defense University, creating an open slot there for quick transfer, for quick, what do you call it, when you raise the rank, the upgrade of General Kariri into immediately becoming a Lieutenant General, so that he can head the Navy. And in a very short notice, he's now the Chief of Defense Force. And from the Navy, that not so many people, particularly those people who understand the military ranks, will tell you that is not what the Tonje rules are all about. But be as it may, he's been appointed as the Chief of Defense Forces, and we wish him well, and all the other people that have been appointed.
Right.
Yes.
All right, so those are the changes so far within the military. A lot of changes had been made, but of course, actually he's just been sworn in this morning. There was a live event at State House, and so he's been sworn in officially amongst other major generals and lieutenant generals who have as well been promoted to various positions within the military. So that is something that we'll be keeping tabs on and giving you more information as we go on within other broadcasts in the day. Now, I'd love us to switch our minds to an event that Kenya was, host of earlier this week, and that was on the EDA 21 African Heads of Summit event that happened at the Kenyatta International Convention Center at KICC, where we saw a number of heads of state attending. Uganda's President Yoweri Museveni was present, Tanzania's President, that is Samia Suluhu, was present, amongst many other African heads of state. Now, EDA is an international development association that is a part of the World Bank, which basically finances and funds and gives loans to developing countries, funding different projects and programs. And there was something interesting that popped out of that particular convention, where the president of Uganda, Yoweri Museveni, in his own words, which I do quote, says, "Africa does not need sustainable underdevelopment. What Africa needs is socio-economic transformation." So before I can get Ngaida's views on that, let's just listen in a bit to Uganda's President Yoweri Museveni and what he really stamped authority on at that particular convention. All right, so we'll be getting back to that in just a bit as they find it. But Ngaira, you know, to host this kind of event as a country where a lot of heads of state are coming in, and this is not the first event we've actually hosted where heads of state are coming in, seems to cement our position as Kenya within East Africa and Africa at large.
Definitely, and even as we continue, we hope that we continue to have such mainstream events. It just shows that Kenya's role in as far as the African, Pan-African initiatives, especially those that touches on economic development are concerned, is a country that is at the forefront. And President William Ruto, you know, even though he's only served a year as a president, maybe a year or two as a president, but has been at the forefront, as the new face that is championing transformation and reform agenda within the African continent, and particularly with a focus on personal reliance, so that the continent is able to transition to a situation where they only have strategic partnerships that are also profitable to the continent. And I think President Yoweri Museveni, who is an old hand, he's been a president for the last 36 years, so he's an experienced, he's probably the most experienced president currently. He only goes head to head with the current president of Obiang Nguema, the current president of Guinea-Bissau, somewhere there. He's also served almost the same amount of time. So he's been around and he's been able to study the trends of geopolitics and how Western nations have been, you know, relating to African continent. And I think he's very right on the issues that he responded to, because our time has come that Africans, being that we know that it has the most potential now out of the other 6 continents that we have, because of its virginity, if you may say, it has so much potential that can still be tapped, that has already been over tapped in other areas, and so it creates room for many other vultures that want to come in and take advantage of the opportunities that are within here. And I think President Museveni was right in his own conscience that if at all we are to form any kind of partnership with the World Bank, the IMF, and any other global institution that work with any other global institution that is concerned with international funding, it should be on engagements that are mutually beneficial and not just investments that are strategic to their own interest. I've always had an issue with the kind of relationship, for example, our country has with the US. They only say that they want to partner with us on military issues so that we can help them fight the insurgents in Somalia. Now, you know, that's not our fault. That's not our war. You know, so I always wonder. That is always when President Obama was here, I got a chance to attend a small event here at Ngigiri, and I was just within the audience, just listening to what was happening. And even President Obama, when he was speaking about the kind of partnerships that he was working on in Kenya, they were mostly were just on peacekeeping and military. And I kept wondering, for us, we have other concerns. You know, poverty eradication is our biggest concern. And so when we talk about infrastructure and industrialization, that is the kind of debate I ought to have heard from him, saying probably we're going to give you 47 billion a year, $1 billion for every county to build roads and water and electricity. The impact would have been much higher. Cynthia, you can imagine in areas where we come from, how leafy and green they are. If only we can have, you know, good roads and good lights, and we wouldn't have to see the kind of images we've seen this week and the last 2 weeks with the issues of the floods. People living on river, you know, along Nairobi river boundaries, and very tragic scenes of what has happened in those areas. And those people don't live there because they love it. It's the circumstances that have pushed them to live in such areas. So any partnership that this country ought to have has to be something, particularly in the interest of Kenya. Kenya is not at war. We don't need military equipment today. We just need sufficient to police the population, but not the kind of equipment that we need to go into war with other countries. So the kind of partnership that this country needs would least likely have to be military equipment, but maybe infrastructure and an industrialization program, so that we can be able to create good environments and people can be able to get jobs. So President Museveni is very right that we don't just want any kind of relationships. I think Africa deserves strategic and beneficial relationships that work in our mutual interest and not just for the benefit of the donor institutions. Right.
Is it a coincidence that because, you know, the different heads of state took to the stage, spoke about various things, but Museveni was specific on this issue? Is it a coincidence that a man that has been in office for 36 years, you know, is about 80 years old, the longest serving president within East Africa? Is it a coincidence that he's the one on stage directly addressing and calling out the likes of World Bank and IMF and saying, you know, we come to you to fund projects, but you only fund specific projects, but you don't want to fund the private sector that goes back eventually to the people within the country?
He's very right. That's what I've just explained. I'm saying from where he sits and being an experienced president that has interacted with, remember he's interacted with almost 6 American presidents, you know, so he's very familiar with how the global institutions work, and particularly the World Bank and the IMF, which are key institutions when it comes to global funding, is that he then sees from where he sits, and even other people who are keen on observing how such global transactions work. And as I was giving an example of the US and the kind of partnerships it likes to have with Kenya, mostly on issues that are not particularly working in our interest. They have their own global interest, and that's why they're interested in all the kind of wars that are there globally. There are people in Somalia, there are people in the West African countries where there are coups there. The US is somewhere in the Arab nation. They're in Europe, Ukraine, you know, for their own personal benefits. But you see, for us Kenyans and Africans, we have also other goals. Your priorities, Cynthia, might not be my priorities, even though we are all in the same place. So he's very keen and clear on his priority as a leader of his country, and pretty much what affects the continent as well, because he's now an African statesman. He's probably the longest serving president on the continent right now. So he's probably interacted with all the 50 presidents in Africa. You understand? So he understands them well, and being an elderly statesman, then he understands better the history of where the continent has come from and where we're going to. And so he's very right. For me particularly, I support him because he's being, and I'm happy you've said specific. He says specifically on these institutions, I'm not happy with the kind of offers they're giving us, because most of them are only serving their interest. And that's why I've gone ahead to give an example of America and how it wants to relate with Kenya, mostly on peacekeeping and military equipment. Yet we have people here that first of all want to eat, be in good homes, be healthy, and take their kids to school. So any kind of engagement for the benefit of Kenya would have been in those particular sectors and not just military equipment. And so I agree with President Museveni on what he has mentioned, and specifically on these particular institutions that are interested in global funding, because then once that is taken care of, I think we'll begin to see something that is beneficial to us as well, and not a kind of a parasitic relationship that is only benefiting one side.
Right, and you know, Ngaira, we seem to be stuck in this cycle, because if you follow the history, a lot of the African countries, we seem to be stuck in a cycle, you know, where we identify what we want as a development, you know, project in the country, and then we go to the Western people to fund this particular project, and then, you know, the loans that come with it and the high interest rates that come with it, and just how much we are trapped in that cycle of loans, repaying, back to it again, loans, repaying. But will we ever be free as a continent and get funding, yes, but not, you know, a larger percentage of the funding?
You know, Cynthia, I just saw something in the newspaper here about President William Ruto's plans to downsize the number of state corporations. And they're almost actually, I saw the CS, Njuguna Ndung'u actually being specific. He said we have about 288 state corporations, but based on the reality of the devolution now having evolved almost 14 functions, we are going to cut them down to 158 state corporations. That's almost 100 state corporations. And when you do away with the 100 state corporations, you are likely to save, you know, most people just talk about the wage bill, but there's also the rent and the cost of sustaining those corporations. And so if the president lives up to his word and actually goes ahead and does the downsizing, then we'll be able to offload the kind of funds that we need to put into agribusiness and industrialization, because he campaigned on jobs, on economy and jobs, because of the hustler nation narrative. And I think in the context of the African scenario, and based on your question, it is true that it's possible that Africa can be independent, but it can be independent also if we, Cynthia, they always say that the first process of healing, if you're sick and you're going to hospital, is first of all to accept you're sick. You first of all say I'm sick.
Yeah.
Then so that I can cover. I first say I'm sick.
Yeah.
Then you go tell the doctor what you feel. I can't just look at you and say and be able to diagnose you. You have to come in and say, you know, I have some cold, I'm feeling pain in my joints, I've had some tonsils. Then based on what you give us, then we are able to diagnose you. So African to sort itself, it must also start by diagnosing itself. And I think that process of leading us to a situation where Africa can be self-dependent is, if now we look internally, what are the reasons as to why we are depending on those particular people. And it goes back to leadership and management, because Kenya can truly, for example, Kenya and many other African countries, you know, the tragedy of Congo and its minerals, a rich country, but with almost 80% of people poor. Largely, partly you could blame it on the colonialists, but you have to give them a reason for you to come, for them to exploit you. If you're able to mind your business as a state and manage your affairs well, we might not need them. You understand? So yes, that's possible, but then it must start with leadership, and then the many other things that add up to a well-managed state, and self-dependence can lead us to.
All right. So I'm informed we have the video of Yoweri Museveni. So kindly let's listen into that, and then come back and talk about some key 3 things he said are required to boost production within the African continent. He spoke on lowering the transport costs and specifically said railway line. He also talked about lowering the electricity costs as well as boosting the private sector growth. So let's listen into one of the key issues that he talked about, that is the Ugandan President Yoweri Museveni.
The main reason why there is no growth is because the growth factors are not funded. They are not even understood. What are the growth factors? We now talk of private sector-led growth. Yes, but for the private sector to grow, what does it need? It needs low costs of production. Put my foot down, say, I don't want to hear those stories. And Uganda is developing, and it will develop, because I don't entertain that nonsense.
All right, so he says he won't allow that nonsense of going to Western countries looking for funding for the private sector growth, and he's told they're not going to fund that. But in addition to that, he specifically mentioned one way to lift African countries is to boost production. How do we do that? He said lowering the transport costs, and he was very specific about railway lines. Even talked about our SGR at the moment that we do have that was built by the Chinese. Also talked about Tanzania's 2 railway lines, one they've actually built themselves, and says, that is what needs more funding, build more railway lines. It eventually translates to lowering the transport costs of these goods or products that we are moving from one place to another.
President Museveni couldn't have put it any better than the way he did, and it's something that even personally I've shared for many years on what it takes for us to truly transform this country and the African continent. Cynthia, the continent, the countries that are considered as developed are developed because they're industrialized. They're industrialized because there are factors that were addressed by their leaders those days that are currently working, that are benefiting them, so that they're able to produce more, create more jobs. That's why they're called rich nations. You understand? And so for a country to be developed, it must have a strong manufacture. For any country to be considered as a developed nation is because they have a very strong manufacturing sector, and therefore they're able to create more jobs, and they're able to create income and wealth for its people. That's why you have a small country like Germany, for example. When you go to Germany, where they produce the Volkswagen vehicles and the BMW, particularly a small town called Bavaria, that's where BMW comes from, is Bavaria Motor Works, the name of the company, is that they produce almost 1 million units of their Volkswagen vehicles. Now each vehicle, roughly, the Volkswagen vehicle is about $10,000 Kenyan, $10,000, which could be maybe around 1.3 billion shillings, 1.3 million shillings Kenyan money. So if you sell 1 million units, Cynthia, at $10,000, that's $10 billion just from one company, that's generated by one company globally. This is money that all of us pay when they sell Volkswagens in America, in China, in Africa. One company is able to bring in $10 billion, which is almost what KRA collects in a year. You understand? And it's a small country with almost half the population of Kenya. You understand? And it's because it's industrialized. From that money is when they're able to generate some of this other money to be able to build the infrastructure, the roads and electricity.
Yeah.
And for you to be able to industrialize them, there are very important things that you have to work on. And President Museveni has gotten it right. You cannot talk of industrialization without power, Cynthia.
Yeah.
It's impossible.
The
You
price of
need
power is
energy.
expensive,
Yeah.
yeah.
And you can imagine what happens in particular this country. The cartels and the challenges that we've had in the energy sector,
Yeah.
to an extent that the cost of power per unit today is 25 shillings. If you buy tokens in your house, you know you have a minimum amount that you need to pay to buy a token, which is 25 shillings, which is actually the cost per unit. You understand?
Yeah.
And you go to even an African country like South Africa, which is about 6 shillings per unit. If I'm running a company in South Africa and you're running a company in Nairobi, there's no way you can beat me in profit margins because of just the difference that you
Yeah.
have in terms of cost of power.
Yeah.
And then two, after you produce, then you have to work on a distribution, which then is where transport comes in, the transport and logistics, which is a big sector. A lot of Africans haven't quite noted it. Movement of goods and people is a big sector. That's why we have millionaires in such sectors. You understand? And that's why we have global companies like DHL and all that. These are companies that have built their wealth just on transporting goods and people.
Yeah.
And that's why, but you see, when you're moving large cargo, road transport, there's always a debate between road and rail transport. So rail transport becomes very convenient for you to be able to move goods. The kind of labor and fuel and cost that you need to transport, say, 10 containers vis-a-vis what one train with 10 wagons can do.
Yeah.
And then the implication that you have on the road in terms of the degradation of the roads and the corruption on the roads. By the time you get your 10 trucks from up country to Nairobi, and me loading my products on rail from, say, Busia, the Malaba border in Webuye to Nairobi, my train will be here in 12 hours. You will still be stuck in some Weighbridge somewhere trying to grab some care.
Yeah.
That's why the wise people, one day, those who've checked the history of America, because America is considered as the most developed nation in the world, there's always a documentary on the people who built America. It's there, and then they mention the people who built the railway line, those ones that built the banking system. When you look at the vision of those people, is that the guy that worked on the railway line said, how then do we move goods and people faster in an organized way and at a fixed price?
Yeah.
That's why when you take a train from Nairobi to Kisumu, it has me 600 shillings.
Yeah.
But if you take a bus to Kisumu, it's 1800 shillings, which is 3 times the price.
Yeah.
And it had the people who designed the railway line had that in mind, that how do we move people across the country cheaply? But unfortunately for this country, and I keep saying that because of leadership, is that the moment they realize that we're going to move people to at 600 people, and these are all Kenyans, at such a cheaper price, people ended up sabotaging the Kenya Railways, and for many years it had been an abandoned institution. Yet it's very key, extremely key in terms of turning around the economy of this country. President Uhuru Kenyatta tried to really bring back the railway line and the railway services, the Nairobi commuter train and the trains into Nanyuki and Kisumu. I remember the year when he was, just before he left in 2022, when he was finally opening the revamped railway line from Nairobi to Kisumu. I was in Kisumu, and that was the first time for me to take a train, because I came back with a train. I'd never boarded a train, for such a long distance. Never mind, I know what a train is. Never mind, I know what a train is. And I went into the train, and in fact, for that particular day, because they have two services, at the time they're charging 600 shillings for the economy class, and then they had a VIP, what they considered first class, 2,000 shillings. I said, let me just pay this 2,000 to just feel what it is like. And even though it was a good time, there were some challenges as well in terms of services. I thought it was still very low, but I think it's something they're working on. But that was a big relief for those people who were traveling towards that side, those people who are going to Kisumu and also Kakamega, because the train actually ends at Butere, which is where the final end of the train. So President Museveni is very right that those particular areas are critical towards industrialization, because the enemy in Africa is poverty, Cynthia.
Yeah.
And so anything that works towards alleviating poverty, then it should be prioritized. And we cannot elevate poverty without working on industrialization. And the key factors of industrialization are exactly what President Museveni is talking about. You need power, you need transport, and you need production, which is what he's saying in the private sector. And I think if Africa can embrace what President Museveni is saying at a continental level, they will have a bigger bargaining chip, as opposed to when individual countries go into that. You can't have a country that is only whose GDP is $100 billion. competing with a $15 trillion economy.
Yeah.
They'll be able to be overrun. But if you negotiate as a continent, they'll be able to bargain easily, particularly in terms of funding and the debate on interest rates that African countries are being given, because they're being considered as very risky areas of development. And so that gives in a reason to shorthand them. You understand? So I support completely what President Museveni is pushing, and I hope that many other African states can quickly embrace that, including our president.
Right. So alleviate poverty, boost industrialization, boost the transport sector. But the question really is at what cost? Because if you look at a simple example of the SGR, project, which was largely built under the Chinese corporation.
Yes.
And so we are servicing this loan till 2040. And so we're just in 2024. We've got 16 more years to service this loan debt. And it seems to be eating a huge chunk of the country's revenue. And not just for Kenya, perhaps in other countries as well, where there's been a lot of infrastructure that has been funded, whether by the Chinese, whether by the Americans, or even the French. We seem to, the turnover is that we are paying more, and we are paying for a long period that seems to hurt the Africans' economy more than it should benefit. How do we make that balance? That one, we want to alleviate poverty, we want the railway lines, but two, how do we make it in such a way that it is, fair for the Kenyans and even Africans of different countries?
Cynthia, as Christians, they tell us that there's no one human being is an island. Everybody needs somebody. That's why we even have billionaires borrowing and get billions to build more billion shilling companies. You understand? You'd imagine that this is a billionaire that he doesn't need to borrow anything. But then based on our interests and our ambitions, at any one point you need somebody to help you to get somewhere. So there is no exception, there is no rule, there is no doubt that at some point, at any one point, this country, the continent, and the global nations, in the other nations across the world, that they wouldn't need another region for something. We will always need that. What you need to work on are the terms of engagements to make them as fair as possible. But also, Cynthia, you asked me that what will it take to
at what cost?
Before, you said what will it take for Africa to be able to move forward? And I asked you, it starts with leadership. You just told me that Tanzania have built a railway line with their own money. The Kenyan railway line was being built at somebody else's money and at extremely exorbitant costs. And for a project that initially, we had the old railway line, Cynthia. The initial plan of revamping the railway line, the railway system, was to just refurbish what was existing. Because the biggest chunk of the money that was spent on the SGR was actually the money that was spent in buying land and relocating people. We didn't have to spend that money, because the Kenya Railways is one of the largest landowners in the country. Kenya Railways and Kenya Posta and KBC are some of the state corporations that own land, and KCC as well. They own huge tracts of land across the country. So Kenya Railways did not need to go get another extra land to build the SGR. It was a corrupt move that was made by that particular government. And I keep telling you, it goes back to leadership, because it would have been cheaper and be able to be funded by. I saw Jimmy Wanjigi just giving a hint of, because he said that he was one of the pioneers of that idea of how do we then revamp the railway line at the time when, during President Kibaki's time, during the Grand Coalition government. And he said the budget initially, because the plan was just to revive the railway line and then make it a PPP project, so that the government doesn't have to spend money. It just revamps the meter gauge, and then you and me and anybody else that can afford a wagon is able to put a wagon on the line and is able to sustain itself. So that project was not supposed to go beyond 50 billion shillings, and it's something that the government would have very easily be able to fund, so that we can bring back rail transport. But you see, when sharks came in immediately after, when the greedy sharks came in immediately after President Kibaki left, they quickly turned around the project, made it a commercial project, and went into borrowing commercial loans at extremely high interest rates, bringing us to what we now have, over 500 billion shillings in debt. China is our biggest, we owe China the most. We owe
our
China
biggest
the
financier.
Most. It's our biggest financier. We owe China the most. And that is a debt we really didn't deserve to have. The 500 billion shillings, Cynthia, would have built 500 new companies at $1 billion shillings, and that would have totally transformed our job and our economy. The issue of youth and employment would have been enormous. Every single ward in the country would have at least gotten a factory that would have given jobs to our people mashinani. But they chose to put that money into one white elephant, as it was considered then. But they've tried to save face by making sure that it kept going. and it's very unfortunate that Kenyans will have to live with it for the many years to come.
Right. Now, if you look at the Star newspaper this morning, there's an invite to, Kenya's president, that is William Ruto, to head over to the US, while he will be touring the US later on in the month to address the Congress, the US Congress. And there seems to be a battle for, I don't know whether to call it Kenya's attention or Ruto's attention by the US, by the Chinese as well. That seems to really put us in the middle of where do we go now? But it's a good thing because one, this will be history, it will be the first Kenyan head of state to actually address the joint house of the Congress. Perhaps your quick reaction about that.
President William Ruto, there's no doubt that he's on a hunger spree for global publicity.
Charm offensive?
Not really charm offensive. This president, look at what's happened in Haiti and the whole debate that we've had about taking our police to Haiti. At what consequences, at what expense are we getting into such engagements? And somebody would easily conclude that maybe the president is really quick, and even when how he's embraced the African issues, the issues are right. And Kenya's growth in terms of its diplomatic relations is something that we all need, because I've told you there's no country that is an island. We all need partners. We certainly need partners like the US. It's a $15 trillion, almost actually not 15, it's $21 trillion economy. We're just at $150 billion. We wouldn't mind them giving us $1 billion per county. It's not too much to us.
It's not
for 21 trillion, for 21 trillion. And sometimes I always think, maybe Cynthia you can tell me, I always think like maybe President Obama's regime was a missed opportunity. Because if there was a moment that we could, because it's somebody, because it's somebody that has been here, he knows the roads
basically
and the
Kenyan.
Yeah, he's basically a Kenyan. We would have told him it's not too bad for you to give us $1 billion per county, for just for roads, electricity, and if you fix roads, water and electricity, Cynthia, you can imagine, say in your village, can you imagine what that would be? That would be a Lavington by itself.
Game-changing,
you understand? So that was a moment that probably would have put such an offer to this president to be able to. It's a complete waste of time. And I understand why some of if you're watching the American politics now with President Trump, who is coming in November, bigly, is that he is likely to even get more support from the Democrats because of unkept promises in some of the minority communities that have traditionally been voting for the Democrats, because they're saying this was a lost opportunity. You can't even tell that we had a black president because the minority blacks are still on the streets, and they have the highest level of everything that is bad. Illiteracy and joblessness, broken marriages, and all these things that affect them. And that presidency didn't quite give them much, and I think that the same applies to us. So we wouldn't mind any relationship from any relationship that can take us there, but then we need to look at it from a different angle, that what is in it for the president, for this particular president. That is, so the president has gone to almost 56 countries today. 56 foreign trips. No president has been able to travel that much, Cynthia. And you might ask yourself, what is in it for us, and then what is there to show in the last 2 years of having traveled that much? He might be doing it for his own personal network and stuff like that, but it's good for the country if the country is able to work on this and come out with something productive that is for the benefit, the way President Museveni has said, that is for the benefit of us, the Kenyan people, and by extension the African people. If that is what the motive of this particular trip, and also the address to the because then that brings into focus Kenya as a country to the American politicians, because not everybody might be very concerned about some country in Africa, particularly for a state like US by itself is a continent. 50 states. There's a congressman somewhere in Florida who has no idea what is happening in Washington on the west coast. So for a continent like that, addressing the Congress brings into light the existence of our country and the issues that we have at play, and some of the partnerships that must be pushed between the two governments. They could very easily get good endorsements by the Congress, depending on how President William Ruto is able to present himself and our issues, which are much more important than himself. President William Ruto is not important to us. It is what he does that is important to us. And if he's able to secure partnerships that are beneficial to our country, I think it's something that all of us as Kenyans should be able to support.
Right. Now, let's come back locally and just take a look at what is happening. And there was, an intense debate at the floor of the National Assembly, which involved the ouster of the embattled Mythica Linturi, who was the cabinet secretary for agriculture.
Yes.
And 149 members of parliament voted for his impeachment, while 33 voted to not to impeach him or against the impeachment, while 3 abstained. And we've been talking about this fake fertilizer issue and where the accountability was.
Yeah.
And finally, for a member of parliament, that is Wanami Wamboka, who sponsored that motion, to be able to, take head on this particular issue, go to the parliament, got the numbers that he did. Some of the UDA MPs were also among those that voted for his impeachment. Is this the accountability that we were looking for?
Cynthia, this is what not just we, that is what all of us Kenyans as taxpayers were looking for. Somebody that can hold this extremely rogue government into account because of the kind of actions they've taken from the very beginning when they came in. I am very proud of Wanami Wamboka, and he's now my favorite. If you had to ask me, and actually, I was supposed to go see him on Wednesday. Probably if I see him next week, because I know now he's busy. So probably from Wednesday, I'll send a picture just confirm to you. I want to take my personal congratulations to him, because that's the kind of leaders. Those are young man's an old friend, and he's been able to the kind of leaders that we are missing, particularly those of us that come from the Western region. The Shikukus and the Masinde Mwewas. These were vibrant individuals that were able to take up big tasks at extreme personal expenses, and they did so. The late Martin Shikuku, who was our neighbor there in the scheme, I used to talk to him sometimes, and they always used to tell me that, you see, for you to be a great leader and be the type of leader that we chose, I had an option to play with Moi. And I would get my beach plot in Nyali, I would get these homes. It's not like he didn't have that option, he had that option. But he said, I took a personal choice that in my career, for me, I'm going to side with the people. And that is why I never died a rich man. I just had enough for myself. I have a good home and I've raised good children, I've educated them. But I could have been a filthy rich billionaire if I just sang Moi's songs all those years. But I realized if I was to sing Moi's anthems, I was only going to benefit as a person and live amongst millions of very poor people in Butere. Then he was a member of parliament for Butere. And so for me, whenever I see leaders that are walking along those lines, I used to like Senator Halole a lot, because that was his demeanor then. And he's just a public someone that was not so much interested in wealth accumulation, but more of public interest issues. And so Wanami Wamboka, a young man from our great county of Bungoma, is that he really captures my mood and the kind of leaders that I've been looking forward to. And I hope to see him sometime next week to congratulate him, because he's done a fantastic job and be able to mobilize that. And that now mainstreams him as a player in the National Assembly. Cynthia, there are over 349 members of parliament. For you to be able to be visible that much, it means you're a standard politician. And he has proven it even on the ground there, in terms of how he's been able to address local issues are there. He has always said that anybody that talks about us must also tell us what is in it for us. And I'm very proud of him and what he's done here. So for CS Linturi, actually, it's not an impeachment. It's that they voted to set up a select panel that is actually going to look into these issues. So he's still serving as a CS. The panel then has to give feedback to the parliament, so then they can have what you call a committee of the whole house to impeach him. So he still has a lifeline, and we look forward to see what will happen, because I think the panel has been given 10 days to look into the issues. Then they bring it back on the floor of parliament. And unfortunately, the way I look at it, he might survive, but we must consider the braveness of Wanami Wamboka. I hope one day we can bring an even bigger impeachment, not of our CS. We can aim higher. So I saw a joke that said he's etched his name in the books of history. Of course. And the question is, every time there's an issue that is to be addressed, Cynthia, the question has always been, who will bail the cat? Who is the person that will actually not bail the cat? Wanami Wamboka has shown is one of those young people that we can. Senator Rengo, what Senator Rengo made him to become an icon of Kenyan politics. President Moi, Senator Rengo is the only MP who actually impeached President Moi. And at that particular time, the president was also a member of parliament. So he was sitting in parliament. And for him, with the stature of what Nyayo was, and to be able to sit in that parliament and Nyayo is seated there and you're bringing this heavy impeachment, you had to be extremely brave, and that's why he's one of my favorite politicians. And for me to see the kind of efforts that Wanami Wamboka has done, I think is very commendable, and we hope the parliamentary select committee that is looking into these issues can be objective enough to see anybody that is trying to sell fake fertilizer so that we can produce no food or poisonous food is actually committing mass crime. You know, it's a crime against humanity and should not be tolerated by any member of parliament, whether you're in a position of government. So I hope the select panel will be able to be very objective in it. And if this minister is found culpable, you know, sometimes you can be politically culpable of an action, because I know how government institutions work. You know, technically, the person that handles the management and affairs of state departments, the PS, is the accounting officer. So a cabinet secretary or a president is not an accounting officer anyway. So, but you see, the political capital that the CS and the president has sometimes pushes some of these civil servants to act in a certain way, even though themselves will not voluntarily want they will not voluntarily want to act in certain way, because we have some very good civil servants in these institutions, but then they are forced politically to act in certain ways. Then when things become heavy as they are now, you see the same people saying, I saw the member of parliament, Muragara or something like that, Murugara, saying that, you know, the accounting officer is the NCPB CEO, this has nothing to do with the CS. He's trying to play with Kenyans' head because he thinks Kenyans do not understand how ministries work. It is possible that the accounting officers are the MDs and the PSs within those state departments, but you need also to consider the political capital and what the role of the CS can be in such cases. Because Cynthia, somebody actually packed this fake fertilizer and loaded it into the NCPB stores. Yeah. It's not fertilizer that was found on the streets. Somebody received it. And due diligence means even the person that was receiving it for storage had to check the product. Yeah. How then do we end up, you know, and that's what is interesting. How do we end up with fake fertilizer inside an NCPB store, inside an NCPB store, and yet we have something called supply chain management in such institutions who are able to check in the commodities and then sign in that these products have been received, and this is the particular person that delivered the product, and this is the person that has received and satisfied that is a good product. So by the time farmers go to an NCPB store to buy fake fertilizer, there's a whole bunch of people that have been aligned in that crime. And I'm shocked that even though I've seen some of them have been censured, others have been suspended, but we haven't seen the kind of brutality that such characters need to face, because the consequences of such an incident equals to what happened some time back in Nigeria. They were running an anti-malaria program where they're supposed to give free capsules. Remember the capsules that people would take for malaria as an aid, but I don't know, the World Health Organizations. And you can imagine, Cynthia, we had people who actually waylaid the consignment on their way to the owners, and then they were opening the capsules and replacing with chalks and repackaging them so that they can give people chalk powder as they retain the capsules, which is a very unfortunate incident. And so we wouldn't want to entertain such kind of things. I really hope the members of parliament would pay so much into the payment. The select panel that is going to look into the issues of Linturi is able to focus on the specific issues and hold everybody into account, and not just Linturi.
Right, and it's interesting because you know, how this came to limelight was there was an expose that was done, an investigative piece that was done, and you know, John Allen Namu, who, you know, were amongst the people that actually went into investigating and just trying to find all details around this, were able to present their findings to various committees, and they even presented it before some of the committee members within the National Assembly. Yeah. But the most disappointing thing I'd say is when you listen into some of the leaders from the National Assembly who would come out and say, you know, those are rumors and that's a political, you know, onslaught. Do we expect that this 11-member committee will rise above political party pleasing and just be patriotic, or do Kenyans have a view that he will be saved?
You know, Cynthia, as Kenyans, as taxpayers, and as voters, we expect the panel to be objective and work in the interest of the Kenyan Republic. We do not want to preempt any other thing. We are hoping, as Kenyans, as taxpayers, and as voters who elected these leaders to go into parliament and do representation. You know, that's the core function of a member of parliament, is to do representation and oversight in government. So our expectation is that this president, his government and opposition, and everybody that is a serving member of parliament in this house, in this National Assembly, and the specific members in the select panel that is going to look into these particular issues, work in the interest of us based on those three things. But if it happens on the other, if it happens otherwise, and yet we still admit that there are issues that were wrong, then it's up to Kenyans to decide the fate of this country. I've always said we don't have to wait for law. The Constitution also gives us other alternative ways, legal alternative ways of holding these leaders into account. You must know, Cynthia, that actually there's also a recall clause in our Constitution. Voters can actually recall they're even member of parliament midway. You only need to meet the minimum threshold is that he has to serve at least 2 years. So we're almost heading towards 2 years. I think from September there, most of the MPs will have served 2 complete years. So they can actually be recalled. So Kenyans must be very vigilant and be able to hold these leaders into account, because it is not a lie that we have fake fertilizer that was distributed to the farm. That is a fact. It is not a lie that we have some civil servants that actually delivered, they delivered and accepted, they actually received and accepted this fake fertilizer. It is not a lie that there's a supplier who loaded fake fertilizer and took it to government institutions. All these people are not ghosts. They are Kenyans. They are visible. We know where they are. They've been paid taxpayers' money and can be held into account. And it's up to this government, because it's the current serving government, to be able to, at the very least, Cynthia, be able to work in the interest of the people and do something on this issue of fake fertilizer, fake seeds, and also importation of cheap sugar and food commodities.
All right. Yeah. So our time is up. Ngaira, perhaps you can get a final word as we wrap it up. You know, the committee has got 10 days to investigate, table that report back to the National Assembly. So basically, Mythical Inturi's fate lies within this 11-member select committee. So final word is we wrap it up.
I've always said, Cynthia, that no Kenyan made a mistake by going to the ballot and choosing a leader of his own choice, because that's what democracy is all about. But once leaders are elected and you have a government that has been formed, it's up to all of us as Kenyans, as taxpayers, and as voters to hold all our leaders into account so that they're able to serve us, because the government of Kenya is not an NGO. It is funded by Kenyan taxes, and therefore it's important that we oversight this government to ensure that at the very least the tax that comes with our sweat is actually administered well under the interest of our people. And so I want to urge all Kenyans to be able to take on these leaders and take them on seriously, including the president. If the president is incompetent, this Kenyan constitution actually gives us a choice to impeach this president in parliament, or we can also, it's called public through a public initiative as taxpayers, because that's why you always hear the opposition tell you that the first phase of the constitution says that the will of the people overrides the will of individual characters. So I hope these all leaders, all Kenyans will mean well, be able to pay attention to what this government is doing and hold all our leaders into account.
All right, thank you very much, George Ngaira, who's a political commentator and analyst, for coming in this morning to just shed light on some of the issues that the country and the continent is facing. We've had a conversation around neo-colonialism, is put by the words of the president of Uganda, Yoweri Museveni, who was very insistent and says, the Western nations are letting Africa down by funding wrong projects and initiatives, or lack of funding some. And so if you've missed this broadcast, you can rewatch it across our social media platforms on EBN TV. Thank you very much for watching. My name is Cynthia Nanjala. I'm sure next week Fred Njeri will be here. I was just sitting in for him. So thank you for watching. Have yourselves a wonderful morning.